The Area podcast is brought to you by the Anti-Racism in Education Alliance. This discussion-based podcast aims to analyze subjects regarding racism and social justice. We encourage you to talk about similar topics to your friends, family, and surrounding community. Thank you for listening.
Hi everybody, my name is Luna and welcome to the second episode of the Area podcast.
And the topic at hand today is pop culture, music, and miscellaneous trends and how they are intertwined with race, the positive and negative implications that this brings, and we hope to induce an awareness of the origins and consequences of pop culture in relation to race. More generally, in order to fully and truly indulge in the experience that is pop culture, that is also quite inevitable, we must be aware of this intertwinedness. And I think that more generally, or pop culture is so vital to us because regardless of whether you agree with certain figures in the media or not, a vast majority of people, especially young people, are aware of its existence to some extent. And therefore, pop culture somewhat unites us in a sense. It can be used as an instrument for political gain, but also for social transformation, which we'll sort of go into. And it's often been a symbol or indicator of progress or lack thereof. So today we're going to be focusing on hip hop culture as the epicenter of our discussion on pop culture in relation to race and cultural history and more. So as some of us might be aware, pop culture is somewhat symbolized by hip hop culture, with rappers such as Drake, Travis Scott, and Kendrick Lamar being some of the biggest names in music in 2021, and etc. I have a lot of peers that listen to this sort of music, Rian, you included, and I couldn't help but notice that even though they praise and support hip hop music and the culture that accompanies it, that they may not be necessarily aware of the racial, cultural, social, political strings attached to this. And to be fair, I wasn't either until quite recently when we started doing research for this podcast. So therefore, obviously, ignorance and lack of education is somewhat not, I don't want to say inevitable, but it's not necessarily a malicious thing, but we want to bring attention to the links between some of the things in pop culture that you may enjoy and the racial issues and history that comes with it, because it's very important to keep in mind in order to take advantage of our access to products of our civilizations, such as pop culture. Mm-hmm. So we're going to start off with the history of hip hop, and I think Rian has a thing or two to say about that.
Thank you, Luna. And yeah, I completely agree with you and think it's important for us to learn about the origins of hip hop and how it promoted a restructure in social attitudes and opportunities. So I'm going to give a brief history of hip hop, which began in the street corner of the Bronx in the 1970s. So it started out as a cultural movement that incorporated different elements of art. And in the 1950s to the 1960s, it was a difficult time for the Black community because a lot of white middle-class people escaped the social and economic challenges to move to the suburbs, which left a lot of African Americans and also Latino Americans behind, because it led to many challenges as budgets and resources were diverted towards wealthier communities. And this caused poverty and brutality within the Black communities, which led to urban youth turning to the streets for recreation and self-expression. And though a new era was on the rise that was fueled by sentiments of anger, hardship, and abandonment, it transformed despair and racial barriers into numerous creative outlets that dealt with violence. And that's how hip hop basically began. And I'm not sure about everyone, but Luna and I have spent numerous hours on Spotify, 2,500 hours to be exact, mainly listening to hip hop and rap music. And we've also actually made a playlist called Black Lives Matter Movement, which you guys can follow on my Spotify to sort of get into hip hop. But anyways, Luna, I've been dying to discuss all these amazing artists. And I have a whole list of them, but unfortunately, I don't think we have that much time. But let's start off with your favorite artist.
We shall, but before that, I just want to elaborate again on our playlist. We include music that ranges from F the Police, by NWA that represent the dawn of the hip hop movement in relation to race. And we also have more contemporary hip hop that conveys literal or figurative messages of racial justice today and rebellion against power structures or hierarchies that exacerbate this. And one of these contemporary artists is Jaden Smith, the son of Will Smith, who is one of my favorite alternative hip hop artists. He produces all sorts of music, but particularly he has actively used his platform to convey messages of empowerment and justice. Lyrics in his discography, particularly his newest album featuring a song called Boys and Girls, has lyrics such as, quote, "We just want justice to sit up in the house without them killing us," end quote, or, quote, "We just want to paint the whole world, but they paint us as a villain." These lines are clearly an ode to police brutality. It's sort of interesting how hip hop music relates to race in two distinct but also interdependent ways, in that, like what you said earlier, it's related to the racial history and struggle, but it also manifests itself in the form of alternative hip hop or modern rap to express this struggle through lyrics. And I think that through looking at the timeline of hip hop music and its relations with Black culture, socioeconomic injustice, it tells you a lot about the progression or perhaps lack thereof in these sorts of movements. Jaden Smith's music, though I'm quite biased, is a prime example of this movement.
Yeah, I only know his Sire album that and his recent Cool Tapes Volume 3, which was honestly amazing. And yeah, adding on to your comment, his talent is like spectacular because he writes out his evocative lyrics and also like freestyles most of his songs, right, which makes it better, I guess. And
really authentic.
And I also heard that he made a Snapchat original series called The Solution Committee, which, according to Westbrook Media and Snap Inc., offered viewers a real human look at the urgent injustices facing our society and the young activists fighting to dismantle a political system that for centuries has perpetuated systemic racism. So he's not only being involved in the music industry, but also, creating, expressing his talent in other ways.
That's really good. I think in relation to pop culture as a whole, it's very difficult to find so many young artists in our age bracket, essentially, that are actively using their platform in this way fully and transparently, not only through music, like you said. So yeah, that's really awesome.
And now time for Kendrick. We got to dedicate some of our time to him. His amazing albums such as Pimp a Butterfly, Section 88, and Good Kid, Mad City were great albums that successfully criticized the social implications of racism in the present day. And throughout his lyrics, we can learn about his life as an Black African American living in America, and also also about his ancestors. His Section 80 represents his interrelated issues of drug addiction, domestic and gang-related violence, unjust incarceration, and the lack of viable opportunities available on an African American youth.
I think Kendrick is probably the best example of what we're talking about in hip hop culture. I want to elaborate a bit on To Pimp a Butterfly and his song All Right. So a lot of critics have generated links between this album and critical race theory, which, to elaborate or to give a little bit of backstory, is sort of a spin-off to critical legal theory and is also a branch of critical theory, which is a theory that focuses on the extensive confrontation and critique of society and cultures in order to expose or challenge the power structures. Songs like All Right, which is in our playlist, by the way, is essentially representative of 21st century hip hop's confrontation of racial injustice. For example, the pre-chorus alludes to the police and such. However important this is, I think it's also important to address that the insertion of these ideals into mainstream media is also a bit of a double-edged sword that has positive and negative implications, because sure, we publicize it through music and it's very beneficial to normalize awareness to this topic in mainstream media. But at the same time, I think it's important to consider that it's likely that many individuals will listen to these songs just as songs on the radio without reflection on why they came to be, which again ties back into our whole intention with this podcast to induce that reflection. But essentially, I think the normalization of this message is a very touchy topic. For example, I'm not sure if you know the 1-800 song by Logic. It addressed suicide, and it became not only a message for suicide awareness, but also sort of just a general pop anthem. And I think it's important to always reflect on these kinds of touchy, sensitive, and highly relevant messages when we're indulging in music. But regardless, yes, Kendrick Lamar and his music is absolutely incredible from an artistic point of view, but also from when you really look into it.
Yeah, I agree with that. And also adding on to this, like my favorite song from him is probably it's hard to choose, but like one of his songs, I'm Dying of Thirst, we can see how he realizes that he won't see positive change in society until he enacts the change, and that he desires for himself and his loved ones. So we can really see how he reflects like his own personal experience to his songs, which makes it, I guess, a little bit more easier to understand in a sense.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. I think it's really lovely and touching to see multimillionaire artists such as Kendrick Lamar or literal descendants of Will Smith and Jaden Smith, in addition to hundreds of other artists that allude to their roots and have their music be an ode to their ancestors, and also an ode to the current ramifications of racial injustice in history. And however, it's important to praise that however brutal and traumatizing their histories may have been, or especially how, like Kendrick Lamar, how their adolescence panned out in not the best way, how they represent that and how they represent the generational trauma within their music, I think is really important, especially for our generation or in our position of relative privilege to sort of reflect on.
Yeah.
So in that sense, pop culture and its intertwinement with racial relations or any other form of injustice in general can really be beneficial to achieving greater equality and towards progress. But on the other hand, I want to quickly touch upon a little bit less of a praise and a little bit more of a critique of the relationship between popular culture and race. So I'd like to address the aestheticization, it's kind of a hard word, or trendifying, I guess you could say, or trivialization of racial struggle or other struggle, which has been rampant on social media, which is something I've independently observed in the past couple of months. So I think this is a very specific niche, so I'm going to try to explain it a bit more, but I have seen many cutesy pink pictures on Instagram with lovely sparkly backgrounds with Hello Kitty and cartoon characters with speech bubbles above their head. I hope I'm providing a good visualization, but there are these speech bubbles saying things like Hello Kitty says ACAB or Hello Kitty says eat the rich. Obviously critique of capitalism, etc. And I think this is representative of the misrepresentation of a very deep and serious struggle. So sure, you can say that through this, you're perhaps standing in solidarity with a movement. And this can be seen as a beautiful thing and something to be admired. And I'm not trying to refute that, but I think it's important to acknowledge that this neglects that the struggle in itself is not beautiful or is not cutesy and should not be represented by pink sparkles. I'm going on a bit of a rant. But sort of aestheticizing the racial struggle or whatsoever, although it helps appeal the fight to younger generations, it's indirectly or counterintuitively a bit more harmful than good, as when we boil it down, what it does is turn politics and struggle and bloody history into a trend. There's nothing beautiful about politics, in my opinion, and that is coming from someone that literally wants to pursue this field. I believe it's horrible sometimes, and to turn it into a trend suggests that the consequences of political circumstances, especially in relation to race with things like the Hello Kitty allusion that I made earlier. This serious topic is met with a temporary wave of ingenuine activism. And to sort of elaborate on that, even phrases such as Hello Kitty says ACAB or Hello Kitty says, let's eat the rich. The number of posts that I've seen like this or otherwise praising the fight for racial justice through these posts has fallen substantially in the recent months. I remember there was a surge of them in May, June, July. So this is sort of evidence that of the trend-like nature of the movement, and how it was accepted as a trend. Yeah, so I went on a little bit of a rant. So I want to let you talk. I know you have something to say that sort of relates to this about Instagram culture and race and how they coincide with each other. So to segue into something a bit different, we're going to talk about how Instagram glorifies the racial experiences of our generation.
Yeah, they were, a lot of posts were also glorifying intermixed children, like half white, half black babies, right, or half Asian and half black babies. And there were a lot of, people who are trying to defend themselves as not racist by also claiming that they were the mother or, friends with black people, but that doesn't necessarily mean that, you're not anti-racist. And a lot of these people start to, fetish, wait, how do you say fetish size? Is it fetish size?
Fetish.
Fetish. They have a weird fetish for mixed race children. And some people believe, like truly believe, that it's the ultimate goal to give birth to an intermixed child, such as Northwest. And while these children are beautiful in their own right, it's honestly really weird, to see Instagram accounts that solely post mixed race babies. And looking at the comment section of these accounts are like absolutely ridiculous. Like, yeah. And for example, like Jay-Z's daughter, Blue Ivy Carter, she has been critiqued by looking too similar to Jay-Z and not reaching the standards of intermixed beauty. And as such, she has been called ugly. And so it's actually really harmful, as children who don't meet the standards of having curly hair, green eyes, etc., are faced with ugly compliments and are given certain looks because they haven't met the standards. And speaking about these intermixed children as an ideal is really doing more harm than good. And it's time for us to realize that all race and backgrounds are beautiful. So yeah, I think it's time for us to stop praising them as exotic beings, because for those who don't meet these standards, it actually does a lot of harm to them because they feel like they're not, they don't fit in. Yeah, I just thought it was really weird with a lot of people.
Sort of to skew away from that particular mix, I think, since perhaps some of the listeners are in Japan, this exact philosophy, which is not a good one, pervades Japanese culture as well. The ideal of the hafu, which is specific to half white, half Japanese babies, is really idealized, and it's deeply ingrained into a lot of little like children to teenagers,
especially in the international community too,
right? And but like otherwise too, I've seen interviews of girls on the streets of Harajuku talking about how badly they want to have these Western features. And I think that might be another topic for another podcast, on the topic of sort of the invasion of Western beauty standards into Japan and etc. But I just thought that would be kind of interesting to highlight as well, that it's quite literally in front of us, this problem or this sort of convoluted philosophy. So yeah. So essentially, on the other hand, I think integrating racial justice into pop culture or the ideals that the media projects can be harmful, but we should still, of course, keep in mind its merits, going back to our whole conversation about hip hop. So on a lighter note, I think we've touched a couple of points related to pop culture and race, hopefully sort of supporting the mission of area. And although there are so many more links and blurred lines, things to explore, things to condemn, we hope that the overarching message, which is the relevance of racial history and cultural history and its present consequences in relation to the luxury of pop culture and music that we get to indulge in, has been made clear. And it's not a bad thing to be hyper aware of where did this come from? Like, why am I able to enjoy this and such? So, yeah.
Yeah, well, unfortunately, it's time for us to wrap this podcast up. But we hope you enjoyed it and learned about how hip hop artists have paved the way for documenting inequities and racism within American and also internationally. And how the hip hop nation has not only created art and entertainment, but art with a vision and message of changing the world locally, nationally, and globally. And don't forget to follow our Spotify playlist, which you can find at my Spotify, just Rian Tanaka.
Yeah.
So
Don't forget to stream Kendrick Lamar. Support Kendrick Lamar.
yep.
Anyways, thank you guys for listening, and please stay tuned for the next episode of the Area Podcast. Yay!